Senator from Iowa.
I believe that there is an amendment been submitted that hopefully we will vote on called the McConnell Amendment, which basically takes away from the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. The Environmental Protection Agency gets this power from a Supreme Court decision that said they had the authority to do that. That Supreme Court decision was about 2 or 3 years ago, came about 16 or 17 years after the 1990 Clean Air Act was passed. Those of us that were around here and debated and worked on the Clean Air Act of 1990 don't remember any discussion about EPA under that legislation having the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, but obviously the Supreme Court read the law different than we do, and so the Environmental Protection Agency was told you can regulate greenhouse gases. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency didn't have to do that, but I suppose they're like regulators generally. You know, you kind of say, why do cows moo? Why do pigs squeal? And why do regulators regulate? Because regulators know how to regulate, and that's all they know how to do. And so they're going to issue a regulation if they got the authority to do it. The situation is this. If we don't take away the authority and, in a sense, overturn the Supreme Court case, EPA is going to put us in a position to be economically uncompetitive with the rest of the world, particularly in manufacturing. When you increase the cost of energy by anywhere from $1,800 under one study to $3,000 under another study per household, you're very dramatically increasing the cost of production of manufacturing. And if you're worried about too many manufacturing jobs going overseas, and we would let the EPA follow through with what they want to do, increasing the cost of energy, we will lose all of our manufacturing overseas. And I haven't checked the record, but my guess is that a lot of my colleagues that are fighting the McConnell Amendment and think it's not the right thing to do are the very same people that are very chagrined and blaming American industry because jobs are going overseas. Well, if we're going to pass a law that increases the cost of energy in this country, we're not going to have a level playing field with our competitors overseas. And that's why I've always said if you want to regulate CO2, you need to do it by international agreement. Because if China's not on the same level playing field as we are, then we're going to lose our manufacturing to China and other countries. And it happens that China puts more CO2 in the air than we do. And you take China and Brazil and India and Indonesia, and they put a lot more CO2 into the United States, or into the air, than the United States does. And yet somehow EPA is of the view that the United States can cut down and solve the global warming problem. Well, even the EPA director has testified before committees of Congress that if the rest of the world doesn't do it, we're not going to make a dent in CO2 just by the United States doing it. But the argument goes that the United States ought to show political leadership in this global economy we have, and if the United States would do something about CO2, the rest of the world would follow along. But China's already said they weren't going to follow along. Even Japan, that signed on to the Kyoto Treaty, said that they wouldn't be involved in extending the Kyoto Treaty beyond 2012. And so if the United States did it by itself under the guise of being a world leader and setting an example, and the rest of the world didn't do it, Uncle Sam would soon become Uncle Sucker. And we would find our manufacturing fleeing the United States to places where they don't have regulation on CO2, where energy expenses aren't so high, and would lose the jobs accordingly. And in a sense, then, those people that have complained for decades about American manufacturing moving overseas would destine the United States to do more of it. And so I don't understand how people that are concerned about losing jobs overseas could be fighting the McConnell Amendment. Because if you want to preserve jobs in America, our industry has to be competitive with the rest of the world. So I hope that the McConnell Amendment will be adopted, and I hope there will be some consistency in the reasoning of people who are concerned about the movement of jobs overseas, that it's intellectually dishonest to support EPA adopting regulations that's going to make America uncompetitive. There's nothing wrong with seeking a solution to the CO2 problem. There's nothing wrong with seeking, working on the issue of global warming, but it ought to be a level playing field for American industry so that we can be competitive with the rest of the world and not lose our industry, not lose our manufacturing overseas, and not losing the jobs that are connected with it. But it often is the case that when either the courts or the Congress delegates broad powers to the executive branch agencies, it seems like you give them an inch and they take a mile. And there are plenty of other examples as well, and I'll go into some of them in just a moment, of EPA having some authority and moving very dramatically in a way that doesn't meet the common sense test. And the work of EPA on CO2 is a perfect example of first of all, they didn't have to do it just because the Supreme Court said that they could do it, but like regulators, they want to regulate, and they're moving ahead. I suppose they're moving ahead also because in 2009, the House of Representatives passed a bill regulating CO2, a bill that would have made the United States very uncompetitive, as I've stated the EPA will, but the Senate didn't take it up. And I think this administration is intent upon getting the job done, and so they go to EPA, issue a rule because Congress isn't passing legislation. It's so typical of so many things that this administration's doing, that because Congress won't pass a law, that we'll see what we can do by regulation. And so they're setting out to accomplish a lot of change in public policy because Congress won't act, but they're going to act anyway. And if they have the authority to do it, they'll probably get away with it. You know, avoid the will of the people. The will of the people expressed through the Congress of the United States. So the will of the people, Congress doesn't do something. So can the administration ignore the will of the people? Yeah, they can if they want to, but they should not, in my judgment. And it brings me to not only the McConnell Amendment, but a lot of other things that we should be doing around here to prevent this outrageous overreach by not only the Environmental Protection Agency, but by a lot of other agencies as well. Because when the EPA and other agencies promulgate rules that go beyond the intent of Congress and never should have passed, it undermines our system of checks and balances. The American people can hold their Congress accountable for passing laws that they don't like. However, when unelected bureaucrats implement policies with the force of law that they would not have been able to get through the Congress, and that's without direct accountability when a regulator acts instead of Congress acting, these policies that take effect do something that's very wrong when it's against the will of the people. So I think it's time for Congress to reassert its constitutional role. We try to do this from time to time on a process called the congressional veto. I recall last June, the senator from Alaska, Senator Murkowski, proposed doing that on these very rules affecting CO2. We did not get a majority vote, so it didn't happen. Now, maybe in the new Congress, such an attempt would get a majority vote. And if we can't apply that congressional veto again to those rules, then that brings about the McConnell Amendment that I'm speaking about, to take away the authority of EPA to do it. But perhaps we can use the congressional veto on a lot of other issues yet that regulators are regulating, maybe against the will of the people, and I hope we will. But there's one that Senator Paul has suggested that I ask unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor to Amendment 231.
Without objection.
That would be the, he uses the acronym REINS, R-E-I-N-S, but it's called the Regulation from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, or and basically what it does, and I applaud Senator Paul for his amendment, and I will surely vote for it, and that is that we delegate authority to agencies in the executive branch of government to write regulations. If those regulations are considered quote-unquote major regulations, then they would have to be submitted to the Congress for our approval before they can go into effect, and then would also have to be signed by the President before they would go into effect. It seems to me that that's a natural extension of Congress's authority under the Constitution to legislate and to be the only branch of government that can legislate. And it seems to me to be a very adequate check on out-of-control bureaucracy, that they can only do those things that Congress intended they do in the legislation they pass. I would extend my remarks on something a little bit unrelated to the McConnell Amendment, but still to the overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency. And this is in regard to some of their regulations and agriculture. And when it comes to their regulation of agriculture, instead of EPA standing for Environmental Protection Agency, I think it stands for End Production Agriculture. Now, that's not their intent. But in this city of Washington, and I describe it sometimes as an island surrounded by reality, that it's an evidence of not enough common sense being put into the thought process of issuing regulations. And I could give several examples, but I may just give a few. But before I give those examples, I want to compliment EPA on one thing. After a year or two ago, that one of their subdivision heads testified before Congress, and the issue was agriculture, and she said, I'd never been on a family farm in the 20-some years that they'd been working in EPA and yet dealing with agricultural issues. I invited her to a family farm, and she came and showed a great deal of interest, and we had a very thorough tour of some facilities, research, agriculture, and biofuels industries within our state, and they were very thankful that we did it, and I believe that it has helped their consideration of the impact that maybe some of their regulation writing has on agriculture. But still, I'm not totally convinced. And so I would use one or two examples of regulation that's out of control. And one of them would deal with what I call the fugitive dust issue. Now, fugitive dust is a term that EPA uses to regulate what they call particulate matter. And the theory behind fugitive dust rules is that if you're making dust that is harmful then you have to keep it within your property line. So let's see the reality of that. You're farming, the wind's blowing, and you got to work in the fields. And the wind's blowing so hard that you can't keep the dust when you're tilling the fields within your property line. Well, are you supposed to not farm? Are you supposed to not raise food? Are you supposed to not be concerned about the production of food that's so necessary to our national defense and the social cohesion of our society? Because, you know, we're only 9 meals away from a revolution. If you go 9 meals without eating, you know, and you don't have prospects of it, are you going to be able to have revolts like they do in other countries because they don't have enough food? No, we have a stable supply of food in this country, so we don't have to worry about it. But suppose we did have to worry about it. Well, there's more to farming than just the prosperity of rural America, the national defense and social cohesion and all those things. But the point is that they're thinking about issuing a rule. In fact, they've started a process down the road 2 or 3 years ago of issuing a rule, maybe a year or two from now. Hopefully they'll decide not to. That says that you got to keep the dust within your property line. So I just wonder, when I talk about the common sense that's lacking in this big city, not just only in EPA, but in a lot of agencies, do they realize that only God determines when the wind blows? Do they realize that only God determines when soybeans have 13% moisture in September or October, and at 13% moisture you got to harvest them, and you only have about 2 or 3 days of ideal weather to harvest them? And that when you combine soybeans, dust happens. And if dust happens and you can't keep it within your property lines, you're going to violate the EPA regulations. What are you supposed to do? Shut down and let a whole year's supply of food stay in the field? No. Good business practices would say that when beans get to 13% moisture, whether the wind's blowing or not, you're going to take your combine out into the field and not worry about the dust. And does somebody down at EPA think that John Deere's and Caterpillar and New Holland and all those companies are thinking about, well, we got this problem, EPA's, we got to do something about the dust, and we got to control it coming out of our combines, or when our our tillage equipment goes across the field, we have to consider the dust that comes up from tilling the fields? Well, we've asked these manufacturers. They don't have any solutions to these problems, and I think they probably think it's ridiculous after 6,000 years of agriculture throughout our society that it's really an issue. But there's people down at EPA that thinks it's an issue. And so I use the fugitive dust thing as one example of do they realize what they're doing to production agriculture. Another one would be the spilt milk. You know, milk has fat in it. And so now they're saying that dairy farmers, well, if they have above the ground tanks to store their milk, they're just like above the ground oil tanks, and they're going to have the same regulation applied to them as applied to petroleum. Now, the compliance requirements on this have been delayed pending action on an exemption, so maybe this won't go through. But just think how ridiculous it is that people at the Environmental Protection Agency are saying that if you're a dairy farmer and you happen to spill a little milk, you have to follow the same environmental requirements as an oil company if they spilled oil and the cleanup of that. But that's where we are on these sort of rules. I've got other examples like atrazine, the application of Chesapeake Bay requirements on Chesapeake Bay applicable to the rest of the country, as other examples. But I hope that we will take a look at this McConnell Amendment that spoke about carbon dioxide, plus the examples I gave of the harm that EPA regulations are going to be doing to just family farming, and stop to think about, we've got to find ways to stop EPA from doing things that just don't make common sense. And I think a start would be to vote for the McConnell Amendment. And I'm going to vote for it. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.